Hello and welcome to today's session of types of online engagement. Various types of communication can depend on the user or many other different things that we use in order to communicate with people. The first one is going to be SMS via texting. Texting on phones, SMS, or other messaging platforms is becoming the norm as technology advances. The number of phone users is only increasing as more people are turning to mobile phones as their main way of communication. Obviously, as technology advances, the more people are turning to their smartphones, being able to tell them the weather, their flight plans, their train plans, how long it takes to get from point A to point B. Instead of using a printed out version of a map or a map you buy from, like, say, a corner store or a gas station, whatever that might be, people are now turning to simply telling their smartphone device to tell them the nearest gas station prices or the easiest way to get to their buddy's house, whatever that might be. Texting, along with this, is increasing in usage. How we talk to our loved ones, how we talk to our friends, even people who live across the land or in another country. We are using texting or SMS as a way of communicating with these people on a regular basis. Another type of communication is email. Obviously, at some point or another in our college experience, we've gone through having to use emails. 99% of consumers check their email every day. I'm one of those people, I can admit myself. 58% of these consumers open their email first thing in the morning. As many as 20.41% of emails are opened within the first hour of being delivered. 59% of millennials primarily use their smartphone to check their email, while 67% of Gen Z scans their inbox on mobile. 74% of baby boomers think email is the most personal channel to receive communications from brands, followed by 72% of Gen X, 64% of millennials, and 60% of Gen Z. 91% of women in the US use email, compared to 89% of men. People aged 35 and older spend an average of 5 hours per day using email. I know in my work, I use email. I use email to get a lot of communication from stores or information on something I ordered online. There's a lot of things that go into emails that it's not just necessarily a way to convey a message, but it might be a way to convey, say, a sale, a clearance, something that's important that you can simply put into an email and blast out to a lot of people. Another type of communication is posting online. There are numerous ways to engage people online. All online platforms can vary in content and what is available to the continent or country. Some examples of these online platforms include Facebook, Discord, Instagram, X, Snapchat, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, and so many more that there is no possible way I can post all of them on one slide. With so many platforms, the engagement starts with a simple post. In order to engage people online, you have to post something. There has to be something there that draws in their attention, that draws in that want to look at what you are discussing, you are posting about. There has to be some kind of allure to draw them in. And a simple post does that. Obviously, the more you post, the more engagement you'll get, and vice versa. The last type of communication is calling. In 2010, voice minutes used increased from 2.2 trillion to 2.4 trillion by 2021. That may seem like a very small number, but when you think about it, it's really not. That is a lot of minutes used. Now, of course, because of this, because of texting and how calling is more seen as an intimate way of communication, the number of calls that are put out there are decreasing. There's no ifs, and, or buts about it. Especially during COVID, the number of calls would have increased, the number of FaceTime calls would have increased, but as we turn more to texting, as we turn more to posting, the number of calls that we make is only going to get replaced by the number of texts that we put out or the number of posts that we put on. It all is going to change as each generation gets more used to using computers and phones and stuff like that, and how they want to convey their messages, how they want to engage the people. 100% of engagement starts with a message. How that message is delivered is up to you. And vice versa. If you don't post anything, you're not going to get any engagement. You can't hope to engage people on nothing. You have to start with something in order to engage those people. Engagement is defined by how much effort is put in. The more effort, the more bang for your buck. The less effort, you're not really going to see that return. So depending on how much you want to reach your audience is defined by how much effort you are willing to put in to reach that community, that special group, that special whatever. More engagement, more outcome. Thanks.
So, welcome to another session of ambassadors, your role and the way you interact with the community. This one in particular, we're focusing on the behaviors and traits of the wise. So, I picked out this quote from Confucius because I think it's quite clear in how it approaches the problems that I see with the modern world. In particular, the problems of approaching a subject objectively. And this sort of underscores a vital need in our communities. I'm not sure if I'm making much sense, sorry. But the quote is simple, quite straightforward, really. When you are angry, you cannot be correct. When you are frightened, you cannot be correct. When there is something you desire, you cannot be correct. When there is something you are anxious about, you cannot be correct. When the mind is not present, we look but do not see. We listen but do not hear. We eat but don't taste our food. This is the meaning of the cultivation of the person lies in the correction of the mind. Because fundamentally, anything which impacts upon our thinking, anything which impacts upon our objectivity and our rationality can be seen to, well, be subjective, as it is quite definitional, but at the same time be dangerous. So, the overview of this presentation is fairly straightforward. We'll cover over what we've covered so far in these presentations, just briefly summarizing. We will then also talk about the guardian spirit that should sit behind every action you take as an ambassador. We'll talk about some unbecoming or negative behaviors which we should really not see in people in this role. And finally, we'll just have an anecdote of fear. I wasn't sure whether to make it a bit of a joke there because I could have said an antidote of fear instead, but you know, our purpose here is to reject fear in all its forms and promote understanding, so maybe I shouldn't. And finally, the thank you slide, of course. So, the story thus far. So, in June's bootcamp, we discussed the ontology of the ambassador role, that is, the core functions which are expected of you in this role as an ambassador. These core functions, to embody community values, to act as a bridge between members of the community and the wider public, and to be a presence to generate engagement through discussion, are not inherently exhaustive either. We could continue to expand on this subject, but I have decided to keep this brief for the sake of clarity, and of course not to retcon what I said in the previous session. We also highlighted that the society has values and how the ambassador's core function can help in promoting these ideals of integrity, collaboration, innovation, respect, diversity, excellence, and engagement. Yes, hello, welcome. Now, in August, I also pointed out that goldenkey has 3 core values, that of leadership, academics, and service. We explicitly discussed how an ambassador can embody the first principle of leadership through the education of the wider public, supporting the second by opening minds to fact-driven reality. Such activities thereby act in service of the propagation of the truth. This is by its very nature a service, in other words, a value-adding construct through its sincerity, adding to the wealth of knowledge in the collective public consciousness, with the only demand that the resulting discussion remains accurate and objective. We need no further motive than this, and if you're willing to take up the mantle, congratulations, you're in the right place. So, an ambassador's guardian spirit. So, one might ask the very reasonable question, what exactly is it that we are guarding? I've previously spoken at length on the need for us to act to protect fact, and more explicitly, scientific fact. In this era of subjectivity, the facts that represent reality have become subordinate to the individual perspective. The statement that one is, quote, entitled to their own beliefs should never be used to justify ignorance or incorrectness, even one's own. In saying that, we do not need to demonstrate arrogance or superiority on those we criticize or engage in matter of fact. To be kind, inclusive, and show respect is in our community values and should be exemplified at all times. Quote, the truth is that we must be constantly critical, self-critical with respect to our own theories, and self-critical with respect to our own criticism. And, of course, we must never evade an issue. Similarly, truth has been seen in many different ways, and this has generated much contention amongst communities and society more broadly. Philosophically speaking, one can categorize truth in one of three ways: as subjective, intersubjective, or objective. If the truth is subjective, then one's perception is all that matters, an anti-realistic perspective. Surely, such a perspective is not in keeping with our focus on fact, which is inherently objective. And in fact, Socrates, who is famous for his method of dialectical questioning, sought to explore the deeper implications of Protagoras' assertion that, quote, man is the measure of all things, which claims that the truth is essentially subjective and dependent on individual perspectives. This reveals a paradox in Protagoras' thinking. If all truth is subjective, then Protagoras' own statement must also be subjective. This creates a contradiction. If every opinion is true, then Protagoras' claim that, quote, man is the measure of all things, end quote, must also be subject to this same relativistic standard. This internal inconsistency undermines the validity of relativism itself. Thus, one only needs to decide in our case whether we want to guard an intersubjective truth or an objective one. The objective truth is by far the easiest to do so, as it is again the fact of the matter as seen as true by all involved. But it also doesn't expand our guard, metaphorically speaking, and presents difficult problems in the form of absolutism. For example, not all facts or elements of reality can be seen so objectively. Quote, I believe that, if any other normal person comes into my room, he will see the same chairs and tables and books and papers as I see, and that the table which I see is the same as the table which I feel pressing against my arm. All this seems to be so evident as to be hardly worth stating, except in answer to a man who doubts whether I know anything. Yet all this may be reasonably doubted, and all of it requires much careful discussion before we can be sure that we have stated it in a form that is wholly true. However, when we get to the intersubjective category, we now deal with situations where groups of individuals hold a belief of truth about certain circumstances. For instance, Einstein's general relativity can be seen as a physical representation of this fact. We don't have the time, and I don't have the expertise, unfortunately, to properly describe it, but suffice to say, the idea that two independent observers can observe the same event at different times or in different circumstances is quite remarkable. Truth is different from fact through this division. Realism, as I've been applying it thus far, is insufficient. Intersubjectivity is the application of reasonable groupthink, to use modern terminology. In older language, it represents the respect for and protection and development of consensus. This consensus is that of our society, our community, and all the wider scientific community, largely to support our core value of academics. Whilst truth in our context can never be seen rationally to be subjective and necessarily too broad to fit into the objective categorical, intersubjectivity represents a strong middle ground which we can support. Such a view allows for ambassadors to speak their minds alongside the facts while protecting their freedom of expression and our legitimate interest in maintaining the fact and truth of the matter. In this way, we are protecting truth in the form of consensus, as in the agreement of what is true in a group. Quote, "Well then, Protagoras, what shall we do about doctrine? Shall we say that the opinions which men have always had are true? Which men have had... My brain is not reading that straight tonight. Which men have are always true, or sometimes true, and sometimes false. For the result of either statement is that their opinions are not always true, but many be either true or false." So, as said before in June, our community is spread through the behaviours of its members, and thereby its ambassadors represent both the exemplars and guardians of this behaviour. This aspect is still being developed, even now, so through collective effort I hope to see what we all make together going forward. And I hope it's something grand. And finally, through this work overall, exemplify and guard the values of the society to which you are a member of. Such values represent ideals which are normative in nature. We should promote integrity, collaboration, and innovation, among the many others that our community and Golden Key more broadly promotes. Now, this is a very long slide, but don't worry, I'm not going to say all of it. Plato, in his discourse called The Republic, had a look at the role of the individual in an idealized state. Our purpose here today isn't so political, but the idea of a guardian, is one which can be drawn back to medieval times as a protector of the civilized world. What I would like to do is put forth a recontextualization of Plato's discourse, which replaces the division of friends and foe for people as friend and foreigner of science. An ambassador of Golden Key needs to act with a love of knowledge. That is, by the way, the Greek source for the word philosophy, and always zealously seeking out that which we do not know. Instead of annoyance, a vigilant and skeptical outlook is required to ensure the primacy of fact, while promoting valid criticisms of the consensus where there is justifiable reason to support it. Plato uses the analogy of a guard dog to guide the reader through the discourse, deriving the core identity of a guardian as someone with a philosophic disposition, who acts with high spirits to speedily correct and engage with strength those who would threaten the community. In the wider context of his discourse in Book 1, he reflects on the fact that an individual would only have one job in this idealized state, implying a natural extension of the necessary behaviors to include cooperation with one's community as a fundamental requirement. A person who cannot cooperate cannot properly protect those in their charge. It should be noted that a philosophic disposition in this context is a bit more of a discernment rather than a discrimination, but it's up to language translation and the specific nature of the translation which guides the specific wording there. So far we've discussed a few core behaviours which ambassadors should embody in their various activities out and about. Now let's turn our focus towards some behaviours which absolutely should never be exhibited when acting as an ambassador for this community. So, I'd like to at this point in time adopt a model used by pilots called the 5 hazardous attitudes. Such attitudes are not just hazardous to passengers on planes, but also dangerous to the propagation of respect for academics, science, and our community more broadly. In particular, I'd like to focus on anti-authority, impulsivity, and resignation. Academics relies primarily on the scientific method to derive meaningful conclusions from data which is gathered. Whether it is physics, sociology, anthropology, archaeology, computer science, or any other discipline, conclusions cannot be drawn ever without data. But data alone is insufficient to make conclusions. A process is required to extract the very valuable insights which underlie our modern scientific doctrine. The acceptance of matters of fact without due consideration and necessary process represents an action which undermines the very foundations of the consensus-based academics order. This represents a tacit application of anti-authority or contrarian behaviors which need to be rejected wholeheartedly and should not form part of an ambassador's behavioral makeup. If there is new evidence presented, it is an obligation on every ambassador to explore it in the wider context of the current consensus. Secondarily, with impulsivity, an ambassador, whilst needing to act quickly, does not need to act impulsively. This distinction comes as a difference of kinds. The first kind acts without thought or consideration, a naturally reactive and emotional beast, which strikes anticipations more easily than the interpretation required by the second kind, which acts with care and thought for the consequences of one's actions and statements. An ambassador therefore needs to balance engagement with the public in the knowledge that the fact of the matter is more important than being correct in the moment. If you are unsure about the truth of a claim, there is no shame in withholding an opinion. Similarly, we cannot ever support absolute positions. One should never speak in absolutes. Finally, resignation in our context represents a behavior which is unfounded. Everyone can make a difference. This isn't just you as an ambassador. Your position is already recognition that you can make a difference. This also includes the people you talk to. You must never abide the hubris of believing that we are infallible or that anyone else is incapable of coming up with good ideas or new ways of doing things. Thus, ambassadors must act more directly to promote this kind of can-do attitude without incurring the risk-taking of macho attitudes. Science is still a risk-adverse subject, after all, and thus risk management is a core part of an ambassador's function. So, just a brief note before I continue. The following extract was taken out of a video which talks about a time in American history where some viewers may find disturbing content, specifically around Thomas Jefferson and the beginning of the United States of America. In other words, its colonial period. This Bootcamp series is not intended as a political statement or manifesto. Instead, I am using this clip as a performative illustration of the techniques which should be avoided by ambassadors in their role, as they serve harmful means of action to our community. Just give me one moment to double check that I have this. Okay. I think that's fine. Hopefully you'll all be able to hear this.
You might already have noticed, Jefferson is very adept at using a particular rhetorical technique called the non-performative statement. In philosophy, a performative statement is when you say something, and by saying it, you also do it. Like, I sentence you to 5 years in prison, or I now pronounce you man and wife. You say it and you do it. A non-performative statement is when you say something, and by saying it, you do the opposite. Like, we are listening to your feedback. Your opinion is valuable to us. We take your complaint very seriously. As those examples show, non-performative statements are often ways of managing people who might otherwise be a problem. The philosopher Sarah Ahmed talks about them a lot in her book Complaint, because they're still a feature of our world today. You might have heard politicians say things like, we're keeping women and girls safe, or minorities should be treated with dignity and respect, even as they enact policies that do the exact opposite. Jefferson is really good at this technique. He writes constantly about seeking friendliness and brotherhood. But we could read those as non-performative statements. Maybe he said them in order to enable himself to enact policies that directly contradicted those goals. Another technique he uses is painting the decline of Indians' ways of life as inevitable. Let me remind you of these 3 quotes.
The ultimate point of rest and happiness for the Indians is to let our settlements and theirs meet and blend together, to intermix and become one people. And they will in time either incorporate with us as citizens of the United States or remove beyond the Mississippi. In time, you will be as we are.
Here, Jefferson paints the end of Indians' ways of life as something that is just bound to happen, unstoppable. And people still use this technique today, too. You may have heard people describe AI as inevitable, and what they mean is they want you to invest in AI. People describe catastrophic climate change as inevitable, and what they mean is they won't be pursuing policies to mitigate it. It's a rhetorical technique that hides agency. It turns won't into can't, and hides the fact that somebody made a choice to do things this way. Jefferson actually goes a step further, saying that the ending of Indians' ways of life is not only inevitable, but also that it'll make them happy. It's good for them. So I'm not the one who's making it happen. But it's also good that I'm making it happen. Again, at the risk of pointing out the obvious, if you consider someone to be your equal, you generally don't decide for them what will make them happy and then do it behind their backs. Unless you're planning a surprise birthday party. But I mean, other than that very limited philosophical case, you give them liberty and allow them to engage in the pursuit of happiness, whatever that looks like for them. Wow, that phrase, pursuit of happiness, is really powerful. I wonder who wrote that. This inevitabilist rhetoric makes American Indians ungrievable. You may remember that word from our episode last year on death. The philosopher Judith Butler uses it a lot in their books Frames of War and Precarious Life. When you use your words to paint a group of people as doomed, even though they really aren't, you create justification for policies that will harm them. Because, hey, it was gonna happen anyway, right? That's what Jefferson was doing when he painted the decline of Indians' ways of life as inevitable. He was actually giving himself and his colleagues justification to pursue policies that contributed to that end.
Okay. In our context here, the non-performative statement only serves to alienate members of the public and denies them participation in our discussion or actions. Ambassadors must therefore pause and consider their actions before they undertake them, and recognize that such non-performative statements fundamentally undermine the legitimacy and reputation of the organization which they represent. Secondly, when such statements are noticed and used by others, it falls to us who know better to point it out and correct it if possible. In our society today, people have liberty to form their own opinions and versions of truth, but that does not justify the deliberate spread of misinformation. The usage of this technique by others to manage a third other is nothing short of a conversation stopper, antagonistic completely to our goals here. Secondly, to make a person or group ungrievable or to portray a situation as inevitable hides agency behind a veneer of helplessness. No one is truly helpless or resigned to a terrible fate. This isn't like the apocalyptic movies. We as ambassadors should therefore never participate in this ungrievability problem. And if you find it, again, try and correct it. So, finally, I just wanted to recite an anecdote I found while rewatching some of Star Trek Discovery. I know, I'm a Trekkie, what fun. But I think it's quite important to us to understand. So, on the eve of battle, on a cold and windless night, an old general turned to a young soldier. "Tomorrow," said the master, "you will know fear." The young soldier, who had not yet experienced the agony of war, looked at the general with quizzical eyes. "How will I know fear if I do not know what it looks like?" The general replied, "You will know fear because it speaks very fast and it speaks very loud." If that is how fear acts, recognizing it is easy. But as the young soldier considered the general's advice, she asked the question facing us now. Once I know fear, how do I defeat it? We are no longer on the eve of battle. Even so, I come to ask myself the same question that young soldier asked the general all those years ago. How do I defeat fear? The general's answer: the only way to defeat fear is to tell it no. No, we will not take shortcuts on the path to righteousness. No, we will not break the rules that protect us from our basest instincts. No, we will not allow desperation to destroy moral authority. I am guilty of all these things. Some say that in life there are no second chances. Experience tells me that this is true, but we can only look forward. We have to be torchbearers, casting the light so that we may see the path to lasting peace. I thought it quite poignant to our cause as ambassadors, therefore, the prevention of fear from ruling decision-making, and the ultimate behaviour we must do our utmost to resist, almost at any cost. The upholding of principles and our field of academics through the scientific method rests on the fostering of understanding. Its very foundations rest on the values we choose to exhibit. So go out and be shining examples to those who have lost their way. Thank you for your attention. Are there any questions? Okay, so Julia asked, how can an ambassador be more involved in their community using the examples I shared? Okay, so fundamentally what I was talking about today was behaviors. Now, behaviors, as you may know, are things just that you exhibit as you're performing actions. So when I look back at the guardian aspect in particular, we need to consider that humans are fallible, right? We can make mistakes, and the purpose of an ambassador, at least in this guardian kind of mindset, is that we need to be protecting the truth of the situation, the fact of the matter. So when someone says something that is clearly wrong, we just don't sit there and do nothing. We need to correct the record, right? Secondarily, when we come down to talk about our community spirit and our values, the purpose of the ambassador, as said before in the ontological ontological functions, is to embody these. Now, we've talked previously about how we do that more specifically, but fundamentally, it's really just saying, look, if someone wants to get involved in developing science or helping to spread good information and sources, then we respect that and invite them to collaborate with us, right? So it's really about opening up the mind to other ways of thinking while supporting the consensus we have. Now, I also find it interesting, though, that that Plato's remarks here, which, by the way, were written in 400 BC, if I'm not mistaken, if I've got my dates the right way around. In particular, you will notice here that when he talks about guardian, he's talking about the guardian of a city, and I've recontextualized it here as guardian of fact and science. But fundamentally, how we approach the discussion of fact and truth and embody our values comes about through this kind of guardian mindset because, and this is important here, much like the analogy of a dog, right? We need the discernment to know when something is in consensus and when it isn't, right? Because we don't want to be propagating, a conjecture rather than a fact. I'm not sure if I'm rambling on now, but actually, another thing I should also mention as well regarding this guardian mindset from Plato is that his idea of a community, as mentioned, is fairly one-dimensional. A person plays a role in society, and that's sort of what I'm trying to get us to focus on here. Yes, the ambassador has multiple functions, but fundamentally it's one role. So if you want to truly embody an ambassador, at least through the model that Plato recommends, is to purely be an ambassador. Don't try and act as a gatekeeper as well, or a moderator, because that just confounds your position. Also as well, so Julia says here, so as a representative of goldenkey, ambassadors should keep in mind to be being open to new ideas and focus on fact over conjecture when engaging with the community. Yes, fundamentally that's what I'm trying to warn against here. We need to focus on fact, not speculation, but also as well engage properly with the community to properly embody the values of the society. Okay, is there any other questions? Okay. Now, I did also want to mention, though, whilst it hasn't been fully fleshed out yet, in terms of idea yet, I am going to inform you ambassadors that we're planning on having a speaker's corner concept come up soon. Basically, it's where someone would put on a 1 to 5 minute video or session about XYZ, where XYZ is any topic that you would want to cover, really. If you'd want it to be a video on our YouTube channel, make sure you get it approved by us. If not, we can approve it after the fact before it goes up. But the point of these speaker corners is really to introduce you as ambassadors to the community, both inside Golden Key's community, but also out as well, which is why this involves the YouTube channel. Also, if you want to do it in collaboration with another person, like an interview kind of thing, I'm pretty sure that's allowed, but you may need to check with Julia. She has more details than I do. But yes, that's the general concept. So if any of you have any good ideas, please do bring them up. Also, as well, I'm just going to quickly double check before I spout something that's entirely wrong. Yes, we also did inform you that the ambassador sessions are coming up to an end after we finish this year. We hope that so I just want to remind you as well that as we're coming up to the end of the year, we've decided to finish off the Ambassador Bootcamp sessions, as we're not getting the response we hoped for with these sessions. However, if you feel that there's a better way we could be doing this, don't hesitate to reach out and inform us of the way you think it could work. After all, we're trying to do this for your benefit, so if it's not for your benefit, then we need to realign what we're doing. Yes, thank you for joining us. I believe that's everything. Is there anything I missed, Julia? Okay, well, with that said, and that being everything there, I hope to see you next month for another installment of our glorious Ambassador Bootcamp sessions. And hopefully Ariel will join us next time.